click.
Right, you ready? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we're just about ready, I think. Apologise. You ready?
Yep.
Everybody with us? Dorothy, you with us? Exactly as usual. Oh, please don't. I'm not gonna ramble on. You know Craig. Craig can do all his own business. I just want to mention that we got David Kennedy at the back from the Senate Historical Society, something that was formed in the Yes Hub, which I'm very proud of. Spend a couple of minutes with them and you'll be surprised at some of the things that's been dealt with. I'll leave you with Craig. Give him a hard bloody time, please. I'm going to the back first. Enjoy. Thanks for coming, everybody, by the way. Including you,
Well, folk up the back, can you hear me if I'm talking at kind of this volume? That okay? That's good because I'll strain my voice if I shout any louder. I've got another talk tomorrow, so I don't want to burn out. Well, thank you for having me back here. This is, I think, the third or fourth time I've been up to this particular end group to chat about various aspects of the independence debate. So, really glad to be back. Good to see a few faces I recognise. Good to see a few faces that I don't. Today, I'm going to be talking about the finances of independence. So that's always one of the big debates, isn't it? Probably one of the top three. Can we afford it? Are we too poor? I give the game away if I give the answer right now. You all know it. Especially, this talk will be based off one of my more prominent papers that I published in 2016 called Beyond Gers. Again, a few people have maybe heard about that or seen the debate around it. What I'm going to do is we're going to kick off just by talking about the finances of Scotland as we are right now and how we measure them. Because we're all familiar with Gers, aren't we? That annual self-flagellation in the news over how big our deficit is. So very, very briefly, Gers, the Government Expenditure and Revenue Scotland, it's the annual accounting of how much revenue is raised in Scotland, plus a proportion of the UK spending, UK revenue that's allocated to us, minus the expenditure that happens in Scotland and the expenditure that happens for Scotland. Either our share of reserved functions or that benefit the entire UK, however you define any of the words in that sentence, or spending that is done on, say, reserved issues that is spent in Scotland, but it's not done by the Scottish Government. A lot of welfare is in that category. Very brief history of Gers, because there are a lot of myths and misconceptions and legends about it. It was set up in 1992 by Ian Lang, now Lord Lang, Conservative Secretary of State for Scotland. This was at the time when we were still debating devolution. We were right mired into that debate. Gers was constructed then specifically with the intent, we know this from subsequently disclosed memos, it was explicitly designed to undermine the devolution debate, to show that Scotland couldn't afford to take any control over its affairs. It's mice. They breed them big in Edinburgh. There were a lot of issues with the methodology around Gers at that time. Folk like Jim Cuthbert, the now former Chief Statistician for Scotland, spent many years trying to get a campaign going in improving the methodology around Gers. Not much was done in the early years of independence to devolution. The Labour government, the Labour Lib Dem governments, they didn't really do much with the document. It wasn't really until 2007 when the SNP took control that they grasped this document and took on a lot of the recommendations for changing it and improving it. It's actually now fair to say that it offers a fair analysis of Scotland's finances as a region of the UK that has some devolved powers. There are still, maybe you can argue over bits around the edges, and statisticians always love to improve their methodology. I'm quite happy to keep on discussions with folk around that, but as it stands right now, it's certainly better than it was, and I'm quite happy to say that as a statement of devolved finances, it does a decent job. In fact, it's actually used now, the methodology underlying GERS is now used by the ONS for other regions of the UK, the English regions as well as Wales and Northern Ireland. But what does GERS not do? What does it not tell us? It does not model scenarios for an independent Scotland, because things change. Not just the policies that we might want to change with an independent Scotland, just the fact of independence changes a bunch of the assumptions over how finances are raised and spent in, for, by Scotland. So we can't just look at the figures in GERS, especially that bottom line deficit figure, and say, see, an independent Scotland will have a deficit of whatever that number is, because it won't. Things change. So I'm going to spend a wee bit of time tonight going through a few of those changes. One big one, and this is one where it does actually depend a little bit on policy, but it's policy that will have to change, is defence. Because it's quite plain to see that an independent Scotland will not have a defence sector that looks like a miniature UK sector. We're not going to have nukes. We're not going to have aircraft carriers. We're going to have different priorities. We're not going to have little islands somewhere in far-flung oceans where we've evicted all of the natives and sold land to give bases to America. The report the other week about from the UN stating that the UK was acting illegally over its behaviour in the Chagos Islands is damning. And if it had been any other state, I'm sure the UK would be condemning them.
Yes.
We can look at some of the chart up there is not great, I'm afraid. It's not that important, to be honest. Right now, Scotland spends around 3 billion on defence, or it's allocated about 3 billion in spending on defence. But as much as we can glean from very murky MOD figures, it looks like only about half of that is actually spent in Scotland. The rest of it is our share of the UK's bases elsewhere and other networks. So you can imagine an independent Scotland that decides to spend basically what it's already spending in Scotland, but just not spend on the stuff that's getting spent elsewhere. Instantly you've identified a £1.5 billion saving. We could go the other way though. We could say, as is the policy of some parties, that an independent Scotland wants to be a NATO member. They could say that we want to commit to the NATO's target of 2% of GDP. That would actually bring up the spending to about 3 billion. But if we then said, well, we're actually going to spend it on military kit, material and people in Scotland, well, if you pay wages, you have a bit of an economic boost because those soldiers would be spending money in Scotland. So actually, while that wouldn't increase Scotland's expenditure, it would actually increase their income by a few £100 million a year. It's a modest boost. It turns out that if you want to have an economic boost, spending on military matters is about the least efficient way of doing it. As you can see from the Trident debate. Or we could decide we want to be Scotland, the peacemaker, and take the approach that Ireland has. And we could cut spending on military to proportionate what Ireland spends. It would turn out to be about 700 million a year. Now that would be job losses in Scotland, but as I say, that's job opportunities for other sectors that maybe would have a bigger economic boost. Point is, pretty much all of the scenarios that you can imagine reasonably for Scotland in the defence sector, we'd be better off as an independent country than as part of the UK, just in that purely financial terms. Another big one is the debt. The 2014 campaign, we went into that, we were talking about taking a share of the UK's debt and a share of the UK's assets. More recently, you've had groups like the SNP Growth Commission saying, well, we accept that actually the UK would own all of the UK's debt, but Scotland wouldn't have any, but we'd still pay £3 billion a year in interest payments to the UK to cover that debt perpetually. I completely disagree with that approach. That's maybe a talk for another night though. A more reasonable approach is to take that half of that approach that the Growth Commission has taken, to accept that the rest of the UK The remaining UK has that full liability for all of the UK's debt. There's a good reason for this. That would allow the remaining UK to lay claim to being the continuing state to the former UK. In the same way that Russia claimed continuing status to the former USSR, similar to Russia, this allows the remaining UK to keep the UK's permanent seat on the UN Security Council. It also lets them keep intact various treaties and international agreements, like perhaps that Brexit deal that's currently being negotiated. Imagine having to start that from scratch. If we do that, then the UK lays claim to all of the mobile assets, and that are even the ones that are based in Scotland. And a lot of that is things like currency reserves, that's things like military equipment. So again, Scotland might want to have a claim on some of them, especially the currency reserves. If it wants some military equipment, depending on how we set up our defence system, see the previous slide there, we might want to lay claim on some of that kit. We probably don't want to lay claim on a proportional share of an aircraft carrier. It wouldn't float for a start. Even less chance of putting jets on it. But you can imagine then Scotland laying claim to some assets, negotiating that and mortgaging the value of those assets against the value of UK debt. That's a reasonable way of going about things, and that's actually an approach that many countries have done. If we do that, if we look at the reasonable assets that we've managed to identify that Scotland might want, what we find is we cut Scotland's interest payments from about 3 billion a year down to about 750 million a year. Turns out there's not a lot of assets that Scotland might need from the UK. It's worth noting that in these debt and asset negotiations, it only covers the mobile assets. Things like mineral rights get split up geographically. The rest of the UK will have no claim in Scotland's oil or its offshore renewable resources. Unfortunately, Scotland will have no claim on Cornish tin.
That's it over.
This is quite an important one here. I talked about the reserve powers that are where expenditure is done for Scotland, but not necessarily in Scotland. Imagine, for example, civil servants working in Whitehall for the Scotland office. Now, their income is a Scottish expenditure because the work that they're doing is for Scotland. But their income tax, because they're resident in England, will go into England's income revenue. When they go out to the shops and buy something, that VAT is English VAT. The increased demand in those shops results in increased profits, results in increased business rates and corporation tax for that shop. What we found that if we just try and look at the value of the amount of government work that is done for Scotland but outside Scotland, and we look at the value of repatriating that work to Scotland, not necessarily the Scotland office in its current form. Sorry, David Mundell.
Don't be sorry.
Then we've worked out that we could be looking at somewhere in the region of £1.3 billion in additional revenue for Scotland per year. It's quite a significant boost to the Scottish economy just by bringing our government back. And this is one of the things that kind of gets me about the Gers debate. If Denmark moved a good chunk of its government to London and started looking at its finances the way we look at Scotland's, you might think their finances were a basket case country that couldn't run itself. Of course, this is what happens when you move the functions of a country outside of it and stop counting it. Here's another one. This one played into the 2014 debate a lot. This idea that Scotland benefits from the broad diplomatic reach of the UK. And there's actually some truth in that. The UK has one of the broadest diplomatic reaches of any country in the world. It's up there with, I can't remember the exact order, but in terms of number of embassies, it's certainly in the top 3 alongside America and France. But the thing is, that nice gold shiny building there, that's one of the rooms in the headquarters of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. That building's worth about £100 million. Your typical UK embassy costs about £7 million a year to run. Your typical Irish embassy costs about £1 million a year to run. It's not nearly as flashy perhaps, but it gets the job done. And maybe this is something Scotland needs to think about when it's planning these things. Scotland currently pays somewhere in the region of £200 million for the running of these diplomatic offices to the UK. For that, £1 million per embassy, we could put one embassy in every country in the planet. We could also think about strategically placing them, so that perhaps you place it in an area where more than one country, especially if they've got nice open borders like they have in Europe and like we're about to lose. You could have one embassy servicing several countries. You could have an embassy there for, let's say, in Brussels, both for Belgium and the EU. There's also a less spoken about benefit of being an EU citizen. Again, we're about to lose that in what, 22 days? Yeah. If you're an EU citizen and you find yourself in a country where your home country does not have an embassy, you can walk into the embassy of any other EU nation and they will treat you as they would treat one of their own. So by setting up strategic partnerships with EU friends, we could get further savings that way. Point is, yes, the UK has a broad diplomatic reach. There's no reason why Scotland couldn't either. Now we get on to the big ticket ones. These are the ones that we often see in the headlines. Things like savings on not paying for Trident, not paying for repairing the House of Commons, not paying for big UK infrastructure projects. There's a lot of debate over some of these because some of them have Barnett adjustments, so Scotland gets a bit of cash out of them. Some of them don't. Certainly, it's a lot of the case that if there's a big infrastructure project, then you get an economic boost down there that lasts a lot longer than just a simple lump sum cash amount. And it is certainly true that in terms of infrastructure spending per capita, London and the South East get multiple factors of as much of money as some other places in the UK. We think Scotland's done hard sometimes. Go to the north of England. Truth about a lot of these is it's a lot of money. It's a significant amount of money. It amounts to tens of billions of pounds, but it's also spread over decades. So yes, it's significant. Yes, it's worth debating. It's not really going to have a huge effect on Scotland's budget, to be fair. And quite frankly, there are better reasons for not paying for weapons of mass civilian slaughter. Another thing, if you've heard of Professor Richard Murphy, he's quite active on social media. He's written a couple of papers for Common Weal, and he's also written this book, The Joy of Tax, which delves into the murky world of the UK tax code. Again, please, Growth Commission, don't just copy and paste the UK's tax code. At least read it first, and we can pick up a slightly better way of doing things.
It's over 20,000 pages.
Yeah, over 20,000 pages, very complicated, lots of loopholes and exceptions, some of them deliberate. There's a concept known as the tax gap. This is the difference in the amount of money you collect versus the amount of money you think you should collect. HMRC estimates this at around £35 billion a year over the whole UK. Richard Murphy estimates it to be more like £120 billion. Taking the opportunity of independence, and I really do mean taking that opportunity to revise the tax code and build one that is suitable for a country like Scotland. If we just captured a third of that tax gap, our nominal share of that tax gap, it could be worth something between £1 billion and £3.5 billion a year. And I really do mean that this is the time to do it. Because once you're already established as a country, and once you've let that all bed in and settle in, it becomes very difficult to make changes. Look at the stramash over changing the rate of income tax by a penny. Imagine doing that over the entire tax code. It's not going to happen. So, brief summary. In the last 20 minutes, I've rattled through a bunch of stuff. I managed to find £2.5 billion in potential savings, about £5 billion in additional revenue. It's not bad for 20 minutes. Probably probably cuts the Scottish deficit by about half. But here's the thing. Let's put it out in context. This is a chart that often gets a bit of raised eyebrows when I look at when I run through it. Let's look at the state of the UK in terms of its finances, not just Scotland. The inner ring in that pie chart is the share of population of the countries of the UK. So England's 85% of the population of the UK, and the remaining three nations make up 15%. In 2007, England's share of the UK's deficit was 45%. So 55% of the UK's deficit was assigned to the other three countries, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, despite only having 15% of the population. It was quite interesting that a few months ago the UK government put out a statement saying that austerity had been working. They had managed to reduce the UK's deficit down to 2007 levels. So 2017, the UK's deficit was roughly the same as the 2007 deficit. What they didn't say was in that time, the structure of the economy of the UK had changed quite dramatically. Take that pie chart, fast forward 10 years to 2017, and it now looks like that. So what's going on here? The economic policy of the UK has been favouring one part of it more than any other. It looks like just England there, it's actually not. As I say, if you go to places like the north of England, they're suffering even worse than Scotland, even worse than Northern Ireland, even worse than Wales. What's really happening is since austerity came in, the economy of the UK has been benefiting London and the South East. That's where the economic growth has been going. That's where all the spending's going. That's where all the investment has been going. This is what some unionists like to call pooling and sharing. And this is apparently a great benefit of the UK because they do all the work and we get a handout. We can do better than that. The UK is becoming an increasingly unequal country. There's actually a good study done by Eurostat every year or two that looks at all of the countries in Europe and looks at it's known as the GDP per capita of each of the regions within that country. That's this graph here. You can see you don't need to be able to read the countries at the bottom, but what you see are those bars, the bottom and the top of the bar is the poorest region in the country and the richest region in the country. And it's expressed in terms of percentage of the EU average. So countries like Germany, the richest region in Germany is sitting at about 200% of the EU average GDP per capita. A couple of countries missing there. One of them is Britain. If I had Britain back in this list, in this graph.
Jesus Christ.
That's the London effect. Interesting if you really dig into the data, which I'm a data nerd, I love this kind of thing. I'm very sorry, I get very excited about really obscure numbers. Anyone who read my article in Common Space yesterday about statistics knows this. Anyway, I managed to pull out the Scottish data from this data set, and I've added it into the graph. That's the other gap there. If we put Scotland in, right there next to France and Malta. Compared to Britain, we look normal. Now, what I would say is I wouldn't get too complacent on that, because you might notice that the bottom of the graph, and the bottom of Scotland's chart lines up the bottom of the UK. That's the south of Scotland. South of Scotland has overtaken the west of Wales as being the poorest region in the UK in terms of GDP per capita. So we do have work to do. It's only about 65% of the EU average compared to 145% that is Aberdeenshire. But, as I say, compared to many other countries in Europe, we look normal. There is an outlier there, and it's not us. But why are we obsessing over deficits? This is the thing. We've spent a lot of time talking about Scotland's deficit as if it's a terrible, terrible thing. And it is when you're a regional council with a fixed budget. When you're a country, deficits take on a different meaning, especially when you're a country that has its own currency. Again, a shameless stab at the Growth Commission. It's been on my mind lately. It will continue to be on my mind for the next month or so. Let's put it politely like that. If you're a country with your own currency, you can have a different relationship with your national budget than if you are not. Because there's a relationship that goes on here. It's not, the national budget isn't the only thing that's happening in a country. You can broadly split the economic activity of a country into three very broad sectors. You've got the public sector, you've got the private sector, which can be split into businesses and households, and you've got the external sector. This is your trade and your flow of money with the rest of the world. And each of these sectors can have a surplus or a deficit. These three surpluses and deficits must sum to zero, by definition, unless someone's magicking money out of nowhere. Or we're trading with Mars or somewhere not on Earth. Either way, these must sum to zero. The effect of this is if you hold your trade balance relatively steady, as has been happening with the UK, it's the yellow bars up there. Over the last decade, the trade deficit has been roughly stable. The public sector deficit, the red lines, has been shrinking as austerity has been getting rid of public services. The private sector, households, their surpluses have slipped into deficits. Their finances are getting worse. The way to understand this, imagine that the government decides to cut the deficit by privatising all healthcare, so it doesn't need to pay for hospitals anymore. Well, that's fine, but now you need to pay for health insurance. So their expenditure goes down, yours goes up. And that holds across all public spending. Or you tighten your belt and you do with less, which causes your economy to contract. We're seeing both happening in the UK. I mean, we're seeing it especially in the high streets. How many of you have noticed all the empty stores in high streets? It's not all down to internet shopping, although a good chunk of it is, and a good chunk of it is the economic policy that feeds into that. The UK has become a country where Pound World goes bankrupt. That was a graphic illustration of the impact of austerity for me. We've got to the point where basically you're paying for your rent, your heating, childcare, your job's less secure, you're probably on a 0 hours contract, your pay's certainly not going up, things are starting to bite. Private debt has been increasing. The difference between private debt and public sector debt, your credit card has a limit. And if you go into your living room and start printing money, you go to jail. So we can't keep going with this. There's a very good reason why countries only seem to be able to run public sector surpluses for a few years at a time. The UK has managed 3 years in a row of, at a time over the last 100 odd years. Every time it's hit the third year, there's been an economic recession. We're now in year 2 of the present surpluses. Even without the looming black hole of Brexit, I'd be getting very worried. So instead of just obsessing about deficits, sure, be an efficient government, sure, spend effectively, but instead of just obsessing about deficits, maybe what we should do is get more data on Scotland's trade, work out what that figure is, whether money is flowing out of the country or flowing into the country. Very easy for countries like Germany to run budget surpluses when they've got a trade surplus of 20 billion euros a month. 20 billion euros a month flowing into Germany, they actually have to run a public sector surplus just to pull that money out of the economy, or they'll end up with rampant inflation. You can see maybe how you can have a more holistic approach to your budget. Look at your trade deficit or your trade surplus, then set your public sector budget so that households don't go into debt. If that means running a persistent budget deficit, so be it. If that means running a persistent public sector surplus, so be it. Your duty as a government is to protect your people. And that's maybe the approach that we should be taking once we get control of those powers. So, I'll leave it there just with one last little pitch, because my salary depends on this kind of thing. I have to do it. Colleagues get a bit annoyed at me when I don't. Our website is allofusfirst.org. You can go on there, you can find the Beyond Gers paper that I mentioned at the start. You can find all of our papers in the policy library. We have books up for sale in our shop, as well as other merchandise. Our two most popular books at the moment are How to Start a New Country, which is our blueprint for independence. It takes you on a 3-year journey from the referendum through a transition period where we build up all the institutions that we need to run a country, including customs and borders, civil service, central bank, currency, so that on day one of independence, everything's ready, everything works, rather than having long, lengthy transition periods with no end. Our other book is The Atlas of Opportunity. If you've got one of the wee magazines in there, there's a wee review of the Atlas in there. Thank you for writing that. That was very good of you. This is a nice illustration of what Scotland could be. We've got loads of information in there about our geography, or where our people are, where our soil is, all these really geeky stats that I like. It's also just a beautiful book. I have a few copies with me if you want to see it, and if you want to buy one, you can. So, thank you for listening to me rattle on.